Let's explore the useContext React hook with TypeScript. Hello and welcome, I'm Dave. In today's lesson, we'll apply the useContext React hook with TypeScript, and I'll provide links to all resources in the description below. I'll also provide a link for you to join my Discord server where you can discuss web development with other students, and you can ask questions that I can answer and receive help from other viewers too. I look forward to seeing you there. We're starting today's lesson with the code from the last lesson in this series that introduced the useReducer hook. You can download that code, which was lesson 14, from the link to the course resources in the description. Today, we'll extract the data and logic from this component and we'll set it up inside of a React context. This will unclutter our component and allow us to organize our state and logic by app feature. So we have our counter component here, and it has all of our useReducer logic in it. So that adds a lot to the component, and we don't really want that. So I'm going to create a folder over here inside of our source directory, and I'm going to name this context. Now you can have more than one context per application, and you can organize it by feature. So we're just going to create a context for our counter. So inside of this context directory, I'm going to name this countercontext.tsx and press enter. After that, we can create several things inside of here. So I won't start this out like I would a normal component. I'm first just going to import create context. So I can press tab and that will bring that in. After that, we need to pull some things in from our counter component that we're going to remove from there. So it will, of course, make it look like it has an error to start out with, but it won't after a while. So we're going to have our initial state. We're going to bring in our reducer action type, our reducer action that we defined here as well. So this was an enum and this was a type. And then we applied all of that to the reducer, which we're also going to bring into our context. So I'm going to start here on line 2 and then just scroll down, and I'll hold the shift key down on line 28. So I've selected all of that. I will control X to cut it out of the component. And of course, our component won't like that for now. But I'll come over here into our counter context. I'm going to control V to just paste all of that in. So we're going to need all of these things here. Now I do want to define an initial state type. Previously, and I can press Alt-Z so this code wraps, but previously we used the type of initState in our reducer, but we're going to need it in a couple of other places. So let's go ahead and define a type for that. So I'll just put that above, and I'm going to say type, and I'll just call this state type since we're only working with this one today. And then inside of state type, what do we want to put? Well, if I mouse over the initial state, we should get some IntelliSense that helps us out here. There we go. We've got count is a number and text is a string. So I can just select that, and then I can put it right inside of my state type. Now that we've defined the state type, we can use it instead of the type of down here. So let's select both of these, Control D to select the second one. And I'll just switch this to state type, and it works the same way. So if we mouse over state type now, we see that exact same thing that we defined above. And notice we're not using our initial state yet, so it's a different color there inside of VS Code, but we can say that it is the state type. So we've applied it there as well. Now we can save these changes, but our next step will be to pull even more out of our counter component. So let's look at it once again. And we have some other information inside of the component now where we defined counter that we can pull out, and we can put it inside of our context. So here we have the useReducer. Of course, we're defining the reducer now in the context as well as the initial state. We have the increment function, we have the decrement function, and we have the handle text input function. We can pull all of that out of here and bring it over to our counter context where we're handling the state and logic for our counter. And of course, this context will then allow us to use it in more than one component if we want to, and we'll eventually get to that. But first, let's go back to the context, and I want to create a custom hook inside of the context that is going to hold all of this state and logic as we use it. So I'm going to say const useCounterContext, and then inside of that, we'll start out with our initState, And that's once again the state type that we defined. And then inside of the function is where we'll put all of this logic. So now we're ready to go over to our counter component and grab all of this. So I'll start here on line 8, and then I will come down to line, it looks like 17. So I'll press Shift and click. Now Control X to select all of that, and we're just left with our component with the return, which is great for now. That's all we'll need until later on. Let's go back to our counter context, and inside of this hook, I'm going to paste all of this logic. Now let me break it out a little bit. It looked crowded before, so we can see each one. So we've got our useReducer here that we need to import above. So let's do that. After our create context, we'll bring in useReducer. And now that we have it, scroll back down here and we can see it's no longer underlined. So now we have our state and dispatch. We're bringing in initial state, and it will be the state type that we defined above. We have our increment function that uses dispatch. We have our decrement function that uses dispatch. And we have our handle text input. It's using the change event, so we also need to bring that in. I'll just double click to highlight and copy, and we'll import that above. You could also say React.change event, and you might see it that way in some places, but then you'd have to import React up above as well. So either way works. So after we have that change event, let me find that once again here. It's inside of the function we're creating. There we go. It's good, and I don't see any other problems here, and we're using our reducer action type that we already brought in. So that's good, but we're not quite finished with the hook because it doesn't return anything yet. So we need to put a return statement after our last function here, the handle text input. We'll say return. It's going to return the state. It's also going to return the increment function, the decrement function, and the handle text input function. And after we save that, we've completed our hook. And this hook will come in handy. Notice I didn't say export const. We're not going to export it. We're going to use it inside of our counter context. Now notice, even though I imported our create context, we haven't used it yet. And we really haven't used the initial state yet. Even though we have created a hook that will bring it in, we haven't used it yet. So we'll use both of those here in just a moment. We have a couple of things to define as we create this context. And the first will be a type. So let's say type, we'll say use counter context, and I'll just put type at the end. After that, the easy way to get this type is to say return type. We remember our utilities from earlier in the series. And now we'll say type of useCounterContext. And now we've defined our type. So if we mouse over this type, let's see what we get. We've got state, which is state type. Then we have an increment, a decrement, and a handle text input function. And they all return void. And all of this is defined for us. So that's very convenient. Instead of typing all of that out, we can just use that return type utility. And now we're ready to create our context, which we will export. So we'll say export const, and let's call this counter context. We're going to set this equal to create context. And now we can apply the type, which is use counter context type. And then here we need to pass in our initial context state, which we have not defined yet. So between the type that we have here with the return type, we need to define that initial context state before we go ahead and finish creating our counter context. Now, not to be confused with the context type, the initial context state is actually going to have values here where we use that initial state we define. So I'll say const, then init context state. And now this type is the use counter context type. And I see why I've got red lines under each one of those. This needs to be a capital U, even though the function, the hook, actually starts with a lowercase u. I want to name this separately as a type, so I'll start it with a capital. So now that we have the type, and that type is correctly applied in each of these spots, let's go ahead and define what this is. And here we'll say state, And this is going to be the initState. Once again, now notice this is a value. It is not a type. We're setting initial values. So for these functions, we just need to initialize them. So I'll say increment, and this would be an anonymous function, and it's just going to have an empty object here. I can put a comma, and I'm going to Shift Alt and the down arrow, and I'll just change increment to decrement on this next line. And then on the final line, we almost have the same thing, but we'll also identify that event that comes in. So we'll have handle text input. We can have it return this empty object. And I believe when I save, it's going to add an extra space here if you see it, just the way my auto formatting works. But here we need to have our event, which is the change event. And then it is the HTML input element. There we go. Now I can save that. Yeah, and I added those extra spaces there with the auto save. But we can see that that is the correct type. And when I mouse over the counter context type here, you see that same, which I could have just copied this out of here. You see the change event there. Here, increment and decrement is an anonymous function that has a void return, and that's fine for these initial values. Once again, these are values. This is not a type, and here's that initial state value that we defined way up above here, right here as well. So it's actually that value. Those are the initial values for our context. So now we have defined our initial context state, and we can pass that in as we create the context. And then I'm going to save that. Now, every context needs a provider where it can provide the data and the logic that it contains to the rest of the application, or at least the part of the application that you want to receive it. So we need to create a provider here as well. I'm going to scroll for just a little more room. There we go, about right there. And now underneath, I'm going to say export, because we will need to export this, const, and I'll call this counter provider. You might see a generic example of context somewhere that calls this a data provider. You can name it whatever you want, but the convention is to end it with provider, because that's what it does. Now, we'll start this with parentheses, and then of course inside of here, we'll have what gets received. Now, we'll get the children, because if you remember, children are kind of what's in between the opening and closing tags of the component, and we will wrap the provider around the components that we want to receive the information from the context. So we'll say children, then we're also going to spread in our initial state right here. After that, we've got both of those, and notice we've got an underline under the children here. I'm not finished with that, but we will need to provide the state type. And I am skipping something here for React 18, and I want to do this on purpose to show you why, and then I'll come back and fix it. So here I would normally say React node, which is something else I'll probably need to fix. And then go ahead and have our function with the return, and then inside of here I'll have parentheses, and we could set up a little bit more. So I'll say counter context dot provider, and then I guess I need to go ahead and start this out with the less than symbol here. So I start that, and now I'm going to have a value, and I'll set this equal to empty curly braces for now, and we'll come back to that. And then inside of this is where we would have the children represented. So there's a couple of things to discuss here, and I will need to set this value. But let's first talk about the children. Before React 18, you could implicitly say this, but right now you can't. You have to define the children as well. So we need a children type. And typically we would like React Node here, but now we didn't import React Node, so we could do that up above. But React is going to complain about this as well. So we don't want React Node, we want React element here. So we know the provider is going to wrap around React element. So let's define this type above and get rid of a lot of these complaints that we're getting from TypeScript. So I'll say type, and I'll set children type, and I'm going to set this equal to a type that has children, and I'll make those children optional because there doesn't necessarily have to be children. So we'll make it optional. Say it can be a React element, or it could also be undefined, and that should cover it. Now we do need to import React element at the top, so let's do that. And we can just put that after our change event here. Now that we've brought in React element, we'll scroll back down. I think we still had a complaint from children because we had not used our children type. Now, this is using the REST parameters here. So it has to be last and children has to be first. So I'm going to put the children type first as well. Not there. Here we go. Before the state type. Then I can use the ampersand. And I'm just combining these types here. And that works. Notice everything seems good now. So now we have a value that we're passing in. This is where we can use the hook that we created above. So if I scroll back up and we look at our useCounterContext, it has everything we want to provide essentially. It has the state that we're going to provide, increment, decrement, and handle text input. So let's scroll back down and put that in there. Find it here once again. Oops, I didn't go ahead and copy that. Let me scroll back up here and copy this, useCounterContext, and notice it receives that initial state again. So we'll also want to put that in. Once we get down here, we've got the hook, and we'll go ahead and call it, and we'll pass in that initState. So now it's going to return instantly that state and those functions that we need. Now, before we're finished with this, one thing I didn't do as we created this hook above that I should have done earlier, I definitely want to do now, these functions are not going to change. Increment, decrement, handle text input, but they would be recreated. So what we want to do is wrap those in useCallback, and so it always delivers the same functions and doesn't necessarily cause a component re-render in that regard. So I'll scroll back up here and let's go ahead and import useCallback as well. And now that we have useCallback, we can just wrap it around these functions inside of our useCounterContext. So here's where it would go for the first one, useCallback. Start with our parentheses there. And then we'll have a comma here. It will have an empty dependency array. As I said, it won't change. And then we can close it out. Let's go ahead and do the same for the other two functions. So I'll say useCallback once again. We will wrap that around there. And then we'll put a comma here, empty dependency array, and close it. And the final one, useCallback, parentheses to wrap it. And it finishes up down here. So we'll have our, I guess it comes down to another line. So we have our curly braces, then a comma, then we'll have our dependency array and close out the function with that final parentheses. So that should be correct. And the only other change I want to make is I'm going to export this initial state as well. So I'm going to put an export in front of that. And now we're ready to go to our app component and import what we need there to provide that context. So I'll press Alt-Z to wrap that down so we can see the full code. And at the top here, we're also going to import the counter provider that we have. And after we import that, we're also going to import our initState that we exported. And now we can use those in here. So imagine we had other components as well, but we only wanted to provide this counter context to the counter or maybe the counter in another component. We would just wrap it around those. So here I'm going to use that counter provider now. So I'll say counter provider, and TypeScript is going to flag it for something I'm not adding to it, but I'll go ahead and do that after I wrap it around the component that needs to receive this information. Now let's go ahead and specify what we're going to send in with the provider. So here we have count, because we had that in our initial state. And we also had text. And we can provide both of those. Remember, we spread those in before. So now we've imported our initial state. So we can say initState.count. And we can do the same for the text. So initState.text. And that is the initial state values that we are passing in here to the provider. So we've created our context. We're providing it to the part of the application we want to provide it to, but our component over here is still not happy. The counter component, we took everything out, we cleaned it up, but it's not receiving what it really needs to receive. It doesn't even know what these are at this point, and we're not really passing anything into the counter as a prop here either. So what we need to do, and we could create a separate custom hooks directory or just a hooks directory, or we could just create a couple of hooks inside of our counter context file that are exported that deliver these features. And that's what I'm going to do today. But just so you know, you could create these in separate files inside of a hooks directory, and that's common as well. So now that we're back in the counter context, I'm going to scroll all the way down here underneath our provider that we created. Here's our counter provider. And I'm going to create a type first before I create the hook. And this type is going to be useCounterContext. I'm going to set this equal to this object that has count, which is a number. And then it's also going to have the increment function. And if you remember right, that's just void. And it's going to have the decrement function that is also void. Okay, there is our type. So let's go ahead and create our useCounter hook now. So I'll say export const useCounter. Set this equal to a function, and it is going to return the useCounter hook type. After that, we'll define the function. And here we'll say const. We're going to destructure and get the state, and we just want the count from the state. We don't want the text. After that, we also want the increment and the decrement, and then that all comes from our useContext hook, which I need to import above, and that would get it from the counter context that we've defined. So let's go ahead and bring in the useContext hook. Pull up here and put it after our useCallback. And now it should recognize that here below as we bring that in. And we don't have a return yet, so we still have a warning here from TypeScript. But this is fine for now, because after that we can return everything we just got out. So we'll say count and increment and decrement. So notice we're only returning what really applies to the counter part. We're not doing anything with the text at all. So that's our first hook. Now let's create one more for that text type. So here underneath, I'll say type. I'm going to say useCounterContext hook type. I know that's kind of unusual. We just had a text example for the useReducer in the last lesson, so we've got some text in with our counter context. So we could have a payload, an example of that. So let's go ahead and define this type. This would be equal to text, and that is a string. And after that, we also need our handle input, or it's handle text input. There we go, handle text input. And that is the function, and it has that event that uses the change event. That is from the HTML input element. And then after that, we need to go ahead and say it's going to be void at the end. Now we've defined our type. Let's define this custom hook as well. So now we'll say export const, because we'll export this also. We'll call this useCounterText. Once again, a little strange, but just an example. So this would be the useCounterText hook type. And now we can define our function following that. So once again, we'll destructure. We'll say const and state, but here we only want the text out of that. And then we're going to want the handle text input function as well. And this comes from the useContext hook, and that gets the counter context that is defined above. And then we're going to return the text and the handle text input function. Now that we have saved those, we can use both of these hooks that we're exporting inside of our counter component. So let's go back to the counter component. We can scroll up here to the top. Notice we're not using the useReducer or the change event now, so we can eliminate those from the imports, but we do have a couple of imports to add. We're going to import useCounter, and we're also going to import useCounterContext. Now that we have both of those, we can use them inside of the component. So here we'll say const, and we're going to get the count as we destructure the increment and the decrement. And we'll set this equal to useCounter. Looks good. So now let's say const, and we'll get the text and the handle text input. And we'll once again assign those or receive those from, I should say, useCounterContext. So we've used both hooks and we have those values. Now we just need to change a couple of things in our component. So we've defined this as count. We no longer need the state dot here, and I'm going to press Control D because we don't need it in front of the text either. So I'll just backspace to get rid of those. We already have the increment and the decrement. We have our handle text input. Here's the text value. Here's the count that we brought in that we're displaying with the children function that it receives. And everything looks good. So I can save this. We can control and backtick to open up a terminal window. We can say npm run dev to start VDUP. We should soon receive, yes, here's the address. So we can control click here and launch that. And we have our application that displays the count, and we can type text in here. So let's try to increment. Works just fine. Decrement works fine too. Now the great part here is we've cleaned up our component. We've put all of that logic and the state inside of that counter context for that feature. And then any component that needs to receive it, we can just wrap it in that provider that we created for the counter. Let's check out the text. Does it work as well? It sure does. And that's working also. So everything's working as it should be. And I hope that helps explain how to use useContext with TypeScript. Remember to keep striving for progress over perfection, and a little progress every day will go a very long way. Please give this video a like if it's helped you, and thank you for watching and subscribing. You're helping my channel grow. Have a great day, and let's write more code together very soon.